Hey, welcome in, fans of the Flyer. This is your host, Sully, and you are listening to the Talking Out Loud pregame show brought to you by Timothy's Bar and Grill and our friends at Lee's Chicken. Absolutely fantastic to have you in for the show today. If you are on StreamYard, if you're listening on YouTube, if you're on iHeartRadio, TuneIn, or you're just in the Dayton market and have your radio dial to 1410 Wing AM. I am super excited to have you. Thanks for joining the program. We're talking about Dayton Flyers hoops today. So I have to believe that if you're listening to the show at this particular hour, you are not a fan of the Cleveland Browns. Game on behind me. If you're on StreamYard or YouTube, you can see that I do have the Browns game on behind me because in a move of solidarity, I want Browns fans to feel like I'm with them today because I'm really not rooting against the Browns. I'm known Pittsburgher. My allegiances are spoken for as a Pittsburgher. But, I have nothing against the Browns. I think people in Cleveland oftentimes forget that people in Pittsburgh don't hate the Browns a whole lot. And so, I don't hate the Browns because it feels to me like if someone came to me and said that they hated the Pirates, that would feel like very misplaced rage to me. So I've never found a reason to hate the Browns, and today is certainly no different. So welcome in. Talking Out Loud pregame show. We're talking Dayton Flyers versus George Washington. We got a 4:30 p.m. Eastern tip. I actually saw that the game time might be moved back like another 10 minutes. I'm not exactly sure why, but rest assured, fans of the Flyer, we will see Dayton Flyers basketball today after a hiatus from the game on Wednesday. And I said earlier this week that you used to be able to set your watch by Flyers games going Wednesday and Saturday. Now they have the Friday night slate on ESPN. There's Tuesday night games on CBS Sports. There's the regular Wednesdays. There's Saturday afternoons like they're supposed to be. They're all over the place. I wish we could get back to the days where it was Wednesday, Saturday every week because that was really the best way to go about it. That's how Dayton Flyers basketball should be. But anyways, 4:30 p.m. tip, Flyers taking on the Colonials from George Washington. And at 4 o'clock, we have Daniel Frank, contributor to A10 Talk, who is going to be joining the show to give us the lowdown on the Colonials. They are not so great at playing basketball these days, so it's hard to find people that are reliable sources for GW athletics, and Daniel Frank certainly fits the bill for one of those guys. So Daniel Frank coming on again to talk Colonials at 4 o'clock. But before we do get there, I kind of wanted to set the stage today and kind of talk about the Flyers and where this season sits now, and then where we're headed moving forward. Dayton coming into this game today, 10 games in, 7-3 mark. One loss to SMU that is so-so, and then two very, very bad losses to LaSalle and Fordham. I got a lot of dads that listen to my show, and if you're just joining and you yourself are a dad, this segment is definitely for you. But on the podcast this week, we talked about it on Talking Out Loud podcast. Search it wherever you listen to podcasts. But I got a lot of dads that listen to this show, and as a dad, you go through a lot of frustrations with your children, and sometimes you catch your kid pissing on the floor. Maybe she drew on one of your couches. There's always going to be something that makes you angry with your kids, right? And sometimes you might yell at them, you might get embroiled, and get so angry that you have to take a step back afterwards and say, you know what, maybe I overreacted a little bit. But at the end of the day, you're always going to let your kids back into the house. You're very, very rarely are they going to do something so bad that you're going to lock them out of the house. You're always going to let them back in. Cooler heads are always going to prevail, right? And then down the road, you'll make amends with your kids for whatever they have done, whatever that transgression is. And my friends, that's precisely where we find ourselves in the midst of the Dayton Flyers season with what has transpired. The loss to LaSalle was a huge setback. It was a very bad loss in terms of the season and where it's headed and the Flyers' at-large hopes, right? And then the Fordham loss was one of the program's worst losses in 15 years. And I really do want people to understand that the loss to Fordham was one of the worst, if not the worst loss the program has taken in the last 15 years. And I say that because of the circumstances and the context around it. Context is always key, always. And this situation is no different. There's been losses on the schedule that have been bad. Or teams that Dayton really had no business losing to, right? If I look down the 2018 season, for example, Anthony Grant's first year, they took a home loss to Penn. They lost to Hofstra. They lost to UMass, Duquesne, UMass and Duquesne and George Mason. They got crushed by George Mason that year. And all of those teams were plus 200 in KenPom, right? And I'm talking about the 2018 season, right? But those losses don't really mean a whole lot in the context of the season because it was Anthony Grant's first year. You knew there was going to be a rebuild on after Archie Miller left. The roster was in a state of flux. So transpose that up against the loss that we just saw a couple of weeks ago to Fordham. And what I'm talking about right now is that after last year, 29-2 season, it was imperative that the Flyers build on the momentum that was created from last season, right? And this season, they have already failed to capitalize on that momentum. And when you take a loss to Fordham, people around the country are going to take a look at this Dayton team and go, oh, back to the same old Dayton. Now, they lost Obi Toppin, they lost Mikesell, they lost Landers. Of course, they're not going to be any good. But around here in Flyerland, the expectation was that this team would be able to compete for an at-large bid. That no longer is a reality. So when you look at the totality and the context surrounding the loss to Fordham, it is truly the worst loss the program has taken in the last 15 years. And Fordham right now, 244 in the KenPom rankings. And as I am doing this show, they are getting absolutely throttled by a very mediocre UMass team that sits at 113 in the KenPom rankings. They scored 14 points, I believe, in the first half against UMass. And honestly, it can't be said enough. Fordham's 1-4, and their only win is to Dayton. And I challenge people because so many in this fan base, so many people in the fan base, they want to do the, oh, Dayton runs the A10. Oh, this conference is all ours, right? And then you have people in this fan base that say, oh, we got to go up to the Big East. It's time for us to take a step up as a program. Well, I really do hate to break it to people, but you can't take a step up as a program and go to the Big East when you're losing games to LaSalle and Fordham, two programs that have no business even being in the A10 anymore, number one. And number two, neither of these programs should ever be losses to a program like Dayton. And so I challenge listeners out there, if you're going to hold this program to a high regard, if you're going to care about games, game in, game out, and if you're listening to this pregame show, you probably care about the Dayton Flyers a whole lot. But if we are going to hold the program to this high standard, then you must call it how it is. And the way to call it how it is right now in the year 2021 is that Dayton took two absolutely terrible losses to LaSalle and Fordham, ones that have set the program back. And now we're looking at a season that instead of playing for an at-large bid, we're playing for the A10 tournament. And I did have some people, let's level set. And, I like to talk to the optimistic fans out there. I did have some optimistic fans that came into the mentions and they said to me, well, Sully, what if Dayton wins out? And I said, okay, well, let's play out that scenario. If Dayton were to win out, they have 13 games left on their slate. Dayton is playing 23 games this season. So let's just say that they won out, okay? That would put the Flyers at 16-2 in the A10. They would be 20-3. And I absolutely believe that would be enough to get Dayton an at-large bid. If they lost maybe a game or two, let's say they lost to at St. Louis, at VCU, that would be enough to put them off of the at-large line. So if you want to talk at-large, the Flyers winning out is basically the only way that you can do it. And if I'm going to bring you back into reality land, a team that loses to LaSalle and Fordham is not going to run the table in the A10. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking about the scenarios of, well, the Flyers can run the table and they can go 16-2, you have to remember how bad the losses were to LaSalle and Fordham, number one. And then you have to factor in that we're in a COVID year, and there is a really good chance that all 18 games in the A10 are not going to be played by the Dayton Flyers. Putting that aside, talking about some things around the league, and talking about COVID cancellations. St. Louis is still in a COVID pause. They have had a really, really bad time, a lot of bad luck in their program. Their last game was on December 23rd. St. Louis has yet to play an A10 game. And to be honest, who is hurting the most from that, aside from the obvious St. Louis, is the A10 conference, because it is a similar situation to if Dayton last year was on a COVID pause, or Dayton last year had to stop playing games for 2 weeks. What I mean by that is, think about how many games last year the Flyers were featured nationally. Think about how many games the Flyers had highlights on SVP Sports Center, or they were on CBS Sports, all right, on their nightly college basketball segment. That was so much great publicity for the league, for the A10, of course, for Dayton. But when the A10 can be in that spotlight, they absolutely have to capitalize, on those opportunities. And it's unfortunate this year because St. Louis really is the breadwinner. They're the front runner in this conference, and the A10 is missing, just a great opportunity to have good publicity and to have eyes on the league, because when your marquee team is out, that's just one less opportunity for the national audience to see you. And, I feel for Billiken fans, obviously, that, I've had to go through this and haven't seen their team play in almost a month now. But it is a shame conference wide, because you just haven't heard a whole lot about the A10 in the national media, the national slate, and the guys nationally that cover the sport. There really hasn't been a whole lot of reason to cover the A10 conference. In the non-con in November and December, Richmond was getting a lot of good publicity. It was said that they were going to be the front runner in the conference. That hasn't really taken shape. But again, because Richmond was the front runner, because they were the team to beat in the A10, they got national publicity. And you're seeing now the reverse effect that it's having on the league when they can't have their marquee team, St. Louis, be featured in games. And they've already missed out on a national TV audience. St. Louis was supposed to play the ESPN game, I believe, last Friday night, and they had it obviously postponed, which is why I am talking about it. The good news for Flyer fans is that St. Louis has had no positive tests and is set to get back to practice, I believe, on Monday. St. Louis is set to play UMass on Wednesday, and then they'll take on the Dayton Flyers on January 26th. So it's a situation worth monitoring for Dayton Flyer fans, since that game is about a week and a half away. I don't foresee there being any more problems. It seems like everybody on the St. Louis program has gotten COVID at this point with how long their break has been. But signs are all pointing up that we actually should see the Billikens back here in action on Wednesday night. Going around the league, just finishing up here. And again, thanks for joining Talking Out Loud pregame show. We're getting ready for Dayton against George Washington at 4:30 Eastern tip, playing the game at Eagle Bank Arena on the campus of George Mason. And the reason is for the state of affairs in the country right now, term that's used a lot in the last year. Out of an abundance of caution, they have moved the game out of the city of D.C. to the sleepy suburb of Fairfax, Virginia, where George Mason has kindly opened their doors to host the game today. So looking up and down the conference, like I said, UMass and Fordham are going at it right now as I talk. UMass is not struggling with Fordham at all. No one has struggled with Fordham except for the Dayton Flyers. Again, I'm going to keep reminding you how bad Fordham is and how unacceptable that loss was that the Flyers took to them. But UMass is going to improve to 4-1 on the year. That'll put them right on top of the conference with St. Bonaventure. Richmond and VCU are right behind them at 3-1. So Bonaventure, UMass at 4-1, Richmond, VCU right behind them at 3-1. And then you have kind of a logjam underneath. Dayton, Davidson, Rhode Island, and George Washington all right there at 4-2, 3-2. There's nobody has really separated themselves in the conference yet. And then, of course, you have St. Louis down there at 0-0. And I guess the way that the conference is shaping up right now is that there are a couple of tiers, I would have to say. Richmond, Bonaventure, VCU, and we're assuming St. Louis are kind of going to be at the top end of the conference. They're going to be teams to beat. And then underneath is kind of a grouping of teams that has potential to make a run at the A-10 tournament, but isn't necessarily playing for an at-large bid right now. The Flyers are in that group. UMass is right there with them. Davidson and URI. I think all of those teams are capable of making a run in the A-10 tournament, but again, not playing for an at-large bid right now, which is one of the reasons why it does make games against George Washington on Sundays a little bit more frustrating. The Flyers haven't really been in this position for about 3 years where they are not playing for an at-large bid, but, you know, we could win out. I guess we could win out. All right. I keep saying that. I guess we could win out. It's potentially possible. I just don't see how a team that loses to LaSalle and Fordham is going to win out this calendar year. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry. All right. On the other side of the commercial break, we're going to be talking to Daniel Frank, who is a contributor, A-10 Talk. He's going to give us the lowdown on George Washington. That's coming up top of the hour, 4 o'clock Eastern time. And until that time, you're here with me. My name's Sully. I host Talking Out Loud podcast. All you have to do is search Talking Out LOWD wherever you listen to podcasts. And we put out a show, try to put out a show twice a week. And in weeks now where the Flyers are playing twice a week, it's a lot easier. We've been talking to Ryan Mikesell this year. Bobby Worley stopped in. And we always have past Flyers as well, giving their insight into the team. So check us out any old time. If you're listening to us today on the radio, chances are you've come across the podcast at least here and there. Before we do bring on Daniel Frank to give us a little bit of lowdown on GW, I'm going to run through some numbers real quick with you just to kind of highlight how bad this team is. And I do want to set the stage that anything less than a comfortable win by Dayton today will be an absolute disappointment. I'd like to think that the offensive woes, the struggles that this team has had in the early part of the season are now behind them. And honestly, let's kind of set the stage a little bit further that this team's had some roster issues. They've had some roster turnover. They've been trying to get guys into the fold to, potentially, get them more minutes and get them more exposure. And I'm not blind to those challenges. I know that the Flyers have had struggles, and of course, I'm talking about the departure of Chase Johnson at the end of the first semester, right around the calendar year. They had to get Elijah Weaver involved in the action. And then down the roster, they had Moose Amzil. He joined the roster at the end of December. Zimmy, Kobe Brea, RJ Blakeney has been in and out with injury. All of those guys have kind of been in the lineup and out of the lineup. And there hasn't been a whole lot of continuity. I think one of the strengths of the Flyers last year was they rolled out the same 5 every night, same system, and really, they had kind of that same flow, and they had an identity last year. I don't think that I'm really breaking news to say that. But this year, it's been harder for the Flyers to come up with an identity, and that, I believe, is really where they've struggled. So after 10 games, I think we can actually draw some conclusions about the Flyers. So I think that their identity right now is that Crutcher and Watson have to lead the way. Dayton is going to turn the ball over. And they still have had a problem, and they've struggled putting teams away. I believe that those 3 keys are really the identity of this team. So as I put the lens on George Washington today, first things first, this is a bad George Washington team. A very bad George Washington team. They opened the year 1-6 with their only win against Coppin State. If you know anything about college basketball, the landscape of college basketball, you know that Coppin State is really a bottom feeder, and almost always is a bottom feeder. They're one of those teams that you bring in, give them a nice, healthy check, you feed them a hot meal, you beat them, and then you send them on their way in the early season. They've done that quite kindly for the Dayton Flyers a couple of times recently. But anyways, George Washington started the year 1-6, and then right after, that was right around the Christmas break, 3 players on the team, including one of their starters, and you might recognize this name, Jameer Nelson Jr., 3 players announced that they were leaving the program. So if you thought they were bad at 1-6, it looked like they were going to get worse. However, it can be looked at as an addition by subtraction because since these three guys have left the program, George Washington has gone 2-2, and those are all A10 games. So looking at their schedule right now, after that 1-6 start, they took wins to Fordham and Duquesne. Everybody beats Fordham except Dayton. Going to remind you again. And then they lost a game to Duquesne as well, and VCU, which was last Wednesday night. This is the second back-to-back game that George Washington is playing. They played Duquesne on the 2nd and 3rd of January to get A10 play going. And again, they split those games with Duquesne, losing the first by 12 and winning the second by a margin of 2. So I mentioned to you that George Washington kind of stinks, and I need to elaborate on that. Obviously, it kind of does speak for itself when I just listed off, their record starting 1-6 and then only beating Fordham and Duquesne. But if you want me to drill a little bit further into the metrics, the offense for GW is about D1 average, and they play an up-tempo pace, which means they're going to try and get shots a little bit quicker in the shot clock. They'll probably force a lot of shots up because bad teams force shots. And, across the board, when I look down all their numbers, shooting numbers, assist numbers, how often they're turning the ball over, all of those things are pretty much D1 average. So when you think about an average offense in college basketball, that's basically what you're getting from George Washington. So then you might ask yourself, well, didn't you just say this team is terrible, Sully? I did, because they are an absolutely deplorable defensive team. So George Washington defensively ranks 287th in the country, well below D1 average. Their opponents are shooting above 50% effective field goal percentage. That takes into account 2-pointers and 3-pointers. So if I drill into that a little bit further, George Washington is allowing 33% from downtown to their opponents this year and over 50% from 2-point range. Another thing is a lot of teams have been able to get to the free throw line on George Washington. So when you look at this stat, it's a free throw versus field goals made. And basically, there is one free throw for every 4 field goals that are attempted against George Washington. So, the formula is pretty easy for Dayton today. You got to get a lot of shots up, and you got to get to the free throw line. And I think if they do those two things, business will take care of itself today. Again, 4:30 p.m. tip between Dayton and George Washington. And I want to remind you right before we go to the break that anything less than a convincing, comfortable Flyers win will definitely be a disappointment in the Gem City today. Top of the hour, I mentioned we have Daniel Frank from A10 Talk, who's going to join us to talk about the Colonials and give you a little bit more detail into what you can expect today. And then again on Wednesday. That's going to be on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Talking Out Loud pregame show brought to you by Timothy's Bar and Grill and our friends at Lee's Chicken. You can only find it right here on 1410 ESPN Radio in Dayton. Come on back. Welcome back to the Talking Out Loud pregame show. I'm your host, Sully, and thanks for listening wherever you're at. iHeartRadio, tune in. If you're with us on StreamYard, if you're on YouTube, it's great to have you. Typically, we would be doing this pregame show at Timothy's Bar and Grill, but given the NFL playoffs today and the fact that we are playing a not so great George Washington team, we decided that I'm going to do the pregame show from the old Talking Out Loud studios located here in Chicago, Illinois. So quick reminder that we'll be back in action live at Timothy's Bar and Grill next Saturday for the post-game show following the VCU game. I believe that game is scheduled for 4:30 Eastern, just like the game today. So we will be coming to you live at Timothy's Bar and Grill probably sometime around 7 o'clock Eastern time whenever Dayton is finished up with VCU, and hopefully after they get a win. Bring it on now, my friend over at A10 Talk, Daniel Frank. He covers George Washington, among other things, I believe. And while our Browns fans, it looks like they're going to be joining us pretty shortly here because this game is getting in hand. But Daniel, we on our side of the fence, sports-wise, we had a pretty good morning with our Penguins taking care of business, didn't we, buddy?
Yes, sir, we absolutely did. That was really awesome to see Jake Gensel get that goal there. I saw some guys talking smack on Twitter, but, they can keep their one Stanley Cup in Washington. We'll take our 5.
No, we're fine. We're fine. It was a good start to the day. The Cleveland people, they have their allegiances today, but 11 a.m. Central here for me. I was watching hockey, so I really loved it. So let's get into the game here, man. So first things first, I know that you cover the team for A10 Talk. And the foremost tweeter of A10 women's basketball that I know about. But, I did a segment right before we jumped on kind of talking about George Washington. And I don't mince words too often. It's pretty obvious this is not a very good year for George Washington. So let's take a step back. They're in year 2 of a rebuild after firing Maurice Joseph. And I wanted to get your perspective on, do you think the program's headed in the right way? And if they are going to rebound, what does that look like? What does success look like at George Washington moving forward?
It's an interesting question because I really don't see GW as being honestly that different from Dayton in terms of their long-term goals. Yeah. You look at the history of this program. I mean, they were Sweet 16 run, I think, 1994. You look at the early 2000s. I mean, they were the number 6 team of the nation, had a very similar season, ironically, to what you saw with Dayton last year.
Yep.
And then you had the run in 2014, 15, and 16 where they made the NCAA tournament and then won the NIT a couple years later. But then things fell off a cliff. So, I mean, there's definitely no question that the mountain for GW to climb is a very big one. But I do think that Jamin Christian might just be this person to get GW back to where they belong, in my opinion, at top the A10. It's hard to really get a feel for this team for a number of reasons. I mean, COVID is obviously one of them. But I'm honestly more optimistic about this team than I think I felt about GW basketball in probably since Lonergan left.
Yeah, just like the needle pointing upwards, right?
Absolutely. Maurice Joseph is a fantastic human being. He was a great assistant coach to Mike Lonergan. He's a great assistant now under Dave Paulson at Mason. For whatever reason, that experiment did not work out with having him be the head coach at GW. And I think one of the main reasons for that is he struggled to recruit. And a school like GW has the history and the pedigree that they can get guys. But when Maurice Joseph took over, they started losing guys like Darnell Rogers, who's the son of GW legend Shantae Rogers. And they lost him to UMBC, which is not a school GW should be losing out on players to. So, I don't mean to say bad things about Maurice Joseph because he did absolutely the best he could with what he had. But for Jamin Christian, I mean, it's nice to see some optimism around the team again. It's nice to see people talking about GW. He's got his own radio show and also TV show on NBC Sports Washington, which is something that I've never seen from a GW type program before. I know with Dayton and whatnot, you guys have a little bit more exposure because you're really the only team in town, which is certainly not the case in DC. But to see GW starting to try to, move things back in the right direction, I think is really encouraging for sure.
Yeah, and you made a good point, man. I mean, if you look back at the history of GW, I think well, first before I say that, the one thing that people often forget about GW is they're the most well-funded university in the conference. They have the most money of anybody, and that's been true for decades. But like you said, from 1993 until 2007, a 14-year span, GW was in the tournament more often than they weren't. They made eight tournament appearances in 14 years, and now they've kind of had this huge break, and they've only made one appearance in the last 13. So I think you're spot on that the A10 obviously is always going to be stronger when GW is good and they're at the top. But when I was in high school, like GW was always a tough game. They always gave you everything that they could. And Carl Hobbs had he had a tendency of putting too many players on the floor all the time. I don't know why that was. He always put too many players on the floor. I remember that when I was in
far
school.
more than it surely should have. At least 4 times, I remember.
Yeah, and I just remember when I was in school, like every time the GW came to town, you're like, all right, they're going to put too many players on the floor, like at one time or another. But you're right. I mean, I think that was a good place to start the conversation today in saying that, like, there's programs I believe in the A10 that really have they've overstayed their welcome. And start with the obvious, Fordham and LaSalle. And it's not even just from the basketball standpoint. It's everything. I mean, it's facilities, it's support, it's money, it's exposure. Those programs are just so far behind Dayton. But from your perspective, I mean, you go to school at GW, I mean, like that's not really a problem at GW. Like the administration is always behind athletics. They fund athletics really well. And so, I mean, those are things that you can look at and point to and say, hey, the needle is pointing up. We can turn this program around, right?
Yeah, for sure. I will correct you on one thing. I actually am a student at George Mason, not George Washington.
Oh, George Mason. I get my Georges mixed up all the time, man.
But, it's a funny thing because I look at the improvements that Mason has made versus what GW has made in the last several years. GW still does not have, to this day, a basketball-only practice facility, which is one of the things that I really wonder looking ahead, is that something that they need to take the next step? Because, they're putting all this money into baseball right now, and they're building a brand new scoreboard and whatnot. I'd like to see, honestly, a little bit more money come to GW basketball. I know that Jamin Christian's not a cheap coach right now, but you're right. They are definitely up there in terms of spending. But I do think that there definitely could be some things more that are done. For sure. It's really interesting to compare them to Mason because Mason is at the very bottom of spending. But they have a pretty decent facility that they just built for basketball only that's on campus. And Eagle Bank Arena is not a terrible arena. I mean, it's not UD Arena, which is gorgeous. I mean, I was there last year when I traveled with Mason Woman.
Thank you.
And it's a beautiful arena.
Yeah, we love it. Don't worry. Yeah.
But I will say the Smith Center, when it is full, which it is, again, been several years since it has been, is among the best atmospheres in college basketball when it is full, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, we know that all too well in Dayton. I mean, we've taken losses there consistently over the years. I've seen a lot of good Dayton teams go to Smith Center and lose. So you're right. And so that was the other thing, like I've been trying to think about is that when we talk about rebuilding programs, you say, all right, here's how it's going to happen. Right. And I think that with GW, they used to have success under Hobbs going international. I mean, international guys almost every single year. But I don't see that as the way that GW is going to see success moving forward. Do you?
It's interesting you say that because in addition to Hobbs doing that, that was very much a staple of Mike Lonergan. I mean, you look at guys like Yuta Watanabe, who's on the Toronto Raptors right now. It's definitely something that is missing from this current GW team. And one of the things that I really talk a lot about with this team is identity. Because, when Jamin Christian came in, he was very adamant about, and it's become a running joke now in the Atlantic 10 with this whole concept of mayhem, which is almost like Havoc 2.0, which is, was sold to GW fans as it's going to be up-tempo. We're going to be chucking a lot of threes. It's going to be great. We're going to play full-court defense. We're going to turn teams over. But if you look at where GW is in numbers, they're 192nd in Division I in threes attempted. They take 19 a game, which is respectable. I mean, it's, nothing obscene, but it's
pretty average. Yeah.
Average. Yeah. And within the Atlantic 10, they're 7th in 3-point percentage and 10th in made threes. And they also, if you want to look at the defensive side too, because I know you mentioned before how bad GW's defense has been this year, they only turn teams over about 13 times a game. And the thing that kills me, and James Bishop is a player that when he is doing great things, does amazing things. When he is not, he is taking shots like you saw at the end of the Charlotte game and so on, where you're just like, oh my goodness.
Like, what are you doing, man? What are you doing?
You will see this today, I swear, 8 or 9 seconds uncontested to get the ball up the floor every time. And it blows me away because we're supposed to be running this up-tempo offense that's running and gunning, and he's sitting there walking it up the floor. And it makes no sense to me.
You know, you saying that kind of reminded me of when Archie Miller came in and his opening press conference. And I swear I'm going to make a point here. We're on with A10 Talk contributor Daniel Frank here on Talking Out Loud pregame. And thanks for joining. If you're just joining in, talking Dayton GW that tips at 4:30. But you mentioned, you know, that Jamion Christian came in and they want to have an identity. They want to have a brand. They're going to do the mayhem thing. Okay. And you know, he's only in year 2. Last year, 12-20. And this year, you know, it's looking like a similar type of season. And what I'm getting to here is that when Archie Miller came in, he said, we're going to play tough, hard-nosed defense. We're going to run the fast break, and we're going to be good on the fundamentals of the game. You know, we're not going to kill ourselves. We're not going to turn the ball over. Well, in the first 2 years of Archie Miller, like, that's all they did. Like, they didn't play great defense. They turned the ball over a ton, and they weren't really good at running the fast break because they didn't have the personnel to do it. So I think that, you know, this is a time in college basketball where there is going to be some kind of patience for GW fans. But I think, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that the GW fans have patience because there probably wasn't a lot of patience with Maurice Joseph. He was only there for, I think, 3 years, right? So it seems like he's doing all the right things. And you said, you know, he's doing the radio show and he's on television. And those things are so necessary when you're building a program because you not only need to get, you know, the right players, but you need to get people interested again. And that starts from the bottom. And I remember John Calipari said that when he was first at UMass. He goes, building the team was important. But before I built the team, I had to get people in the area to care, you know, and I think that GW doesn't necessarily have that problem because winning will take care of a lot of that stuff. But since we don't know what the identity of this team is, I mean, what can you tell us that we're going to see today with GW against the Flyers?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main things I think that's a storyline for GW right now is the arrival of Ricky Lindo Jr. He is a transfer from Maryland who was originally intending to sit out this season despite the blanket waiver. But then when you had the 3 guys leave, you had Jameer Nelson leave, Maceo Jack, and one other guy whose name escapes me at the moment, he decided he was going to play this season. And he was instant impact against VCU on Wednesday, which was a game that I was very pleasantly surprised by how well GW competed. I mean, they only lost by 8 or 9 points.
Yeah, they were down 14 at one point, and they made it a 7-point game. So, yeah, hey, no quitting those boys. You know, that's what you like to see, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, if you looking at Jamion Christian's first 2 years at GW, they started the season horribly. I think they went like 1-5 2 years in a row or something to start the year. Mm-hmm. But then they started to find something as the season wore on, and guys started to step up. And one of the things I'd really like to see is how this team's going to really step up, especially while Jamison Battle is injured because he's got a concussion. I assume he's still out from this game because it was told to me that it's likely to be a little bit longer term. So very good chance you don't see him today or Wednesday. But I think, was second on the team in scoring behind Bishop by only like 1 or 2 points on average. Mm-hmm. So with a guy like that out of the lineup, you're going to probably see James Bishop a little bit more. But I really would look to see Ricky Lindo Jr. take another step today. I mean, I think had a double-double, if I'm correct, on Wednesday against VCU. Mm-hmm. He did fall out of the game late, but those are things that will come with time and fitting in a new system. Playing a team like VCU, you're going to foul a lot if you're defending because they're a very physical team. Yep. So I would really look to see that. I'll be honest with you, Sully. I think, this is a bold prediction, I think GW has a decent chance to split one of these 2 games with Dayton here.
Believe me, brother. I'm with you. I'm with you, bro. I just watched us lose to LaSalle and Fordham. Like, I take nothing for granted. I'm like, any night, anyone can get us, man. Yeah. So it's not as bold as you think, I promise.
Well, you know, the other interesting thing here is I cannot find the last time that GW and Dayton played on a neutral floor because I cannot find any history of them playing in the A10 tournament that I can ever remember. And
so it would have been 2012 was the last time I believe we played the A10 tournament. So that would have, but to your point, that was when there was still home sites. So
Yeah.
Dayton did not. We played at UD Arena. We didn't play
Okay.
like a neutral site. So
Okay.
the last time that we played a neutral site, maybe like 2010. Yeah, nope, same thing. 2010 they played Dayton in the A10 tournament, and it was at UD Arena. So
Yeah.
you're right. It's probably been a long time. It's been at least 10 years, man. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very curious what it's going to be like at Eagle Bank, because I've actually been to Eagle Bank a couple times this season. I cover the Mason women's basketball team for Giant Killer, which is the GME website.
Yep.
It's an interesting atmosphere because they've been allowing fans in there for home Mason games, but they're not allowing any fans there today for the GW game.
Yep.
So it'll be very interesting to see how GW reacts to that. I understand part of the rationale behind that was they wanted to keep it consistent with the other home games they've had. But the ironic thing is the GW women played a true road game at Mason at noon today, and there were fans there, but there cannot be fans there today for the 4:30 game for the men against Dayton. But
God.
2021, such is the world.
Yeah, that's it, man. Like the rules don't have to make sense anymore. Just the rules are the rules. And I had a friend that texted me right before the show who lives in the DC area, and he said he called Mason and they told him like, oh, we're not letting fans in. So again, it's just one of those things you kind of have to shake your head at, because you're just like, that doesn't necessarily make sense in my brain, but a lot of things don't make sense in my brain.
Yeah.
So I will say, and again, if you're just joining us, finishing up with Daniel Frank, contributor, A10 Talk. Talking Dayton against GW coming up here in about 15-ish minutes. So, okay, you mentioned that your bold prediction is that you think the teams are going to split. I also think that is very possible. I'll put my homer glasses on for a second. I say I think Dayton's going to come out with both of these wins, but I will say this to you before I get your prediction. The way that Dayton is going to lose, and the way that they're going to lose the whole rest of the season, is if Ibby Watson and Jalen Crutcher don't take at least 25 shots and account for about 30 points. That's it for Dayton. Like, that's how they beat teams. That's how they're successful. That's the ingredient to the sauce, right? So if you do see Dayton lose one of these games, that's going to be it. So, all right, what's your prediction for the two games? You going to stick with it? They're going to split them?
I'll stick with that. I will say, I think the recipe for GW is, in addition to what you said, it's got to be shooting threes and hitting their threes. I watched very closely the Mason game against Dayton because I also covered the Mason men's team too. That was how Mason made their run at the beginning of the second half, was hitting their threes. So I really think that if GW is going to have any chance here, you're going to have to probably see 40 points between Bishop and Ricky Lindo Jr.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say today, I think GW might steal this one by like 4 or 5 points and then probably get smacked by Dayton on Wednesday at UD Arena. that would probably be my guess, knowing the A10.
Bold predictions only on Talking Out Loud. I said that I think today is a day where I go Flyers cover and the over. But any insight on the point total? You said that we're probably going to have to get in a track meet if GW wants to win this one. They've been giving up 70 points pretty much every night. And the Flyers, I saw their total today was like 73.5. So I was all over that. I think the Flyers are going to score a lot today. What do you think on that? 139.5 is the line right now. Are we going over or under?
I'll honestly take the under, because if GW is going to win, it's going to have to be under that, because Dayton's going to have to shoot terribly.
It's got to be ugly.
35-40. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is exactly right. If you heard it here from Daniel Frank, if GW is going to win this game today, it has to be ugly. I always give our guests on the show final thoughts before we take them to commercial break, and then we're going to finish up talking about the the NCAA tournament, and then I'll give you some fun facts on the other side of the break about the series between George Washington and Dayton. And I'm even going to go in the Wayback Machine and remind listeners about one of my favorite Dayton GW contests that happened in 2005. But before I get to the break and we get to all that on the other side of the show, final thoughts for every guest that comes on Talking Out Loud, and you, my friend, are no different. Final thoughts for Dayton listeners heading into the GW game today.
I will say, if I could just make one pitch to you, because I know that the order gets talked a lot about within their place in the Atlantic 10 Conference. I will forever die on this hill that I think Florida belongs, not because of their men's basketball program, but because of their women's basketball program.
That's true.
They are consistently one of the top teams in the Atlantic 10. They won the A10 tournament a couple years ago. So that is my hill to die on, that I do think from a women's basketball perspective, which I know does not get a lot of respect in the nation, but I think they absolutely belong in the Atlantic 10. For today, we'll see what happens. Who knows? It's 2021. Anything can happen.
Yeah, anything can happen, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on, filling some time for us on the pregame show, and yeah, we're gonna do it again on Wednesday. So there's gonna be plenty of Dayton GW basketball to go around this week, brother.
All right, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
No doubt, man. That's Daniel Frank, A10 Talk contributor that also covers, as you heard, GW and Mason basketball, and is one of the foremost women's basketball tweeters in the A10 Twitter universe. I mentioned other side of the break. I'm going to give you some fun facts about the Dayton GW series. I'm going to talk about the NCAA tournament. That's all in the last 5 minutes of the show. You're listening to the Talking Out Loud pregame show brought to you by Timothy's Bar and Grill and our friends at Lee's Chicken. And you can only find it right here on 1410 ESPN Radio in Dayton. Hey, welcome back. This is the Talking Out Loud pregame show, getting you ready for Dayton against GW, coming up here at 4:30 Eastern time from Eagle Bank Arena on the campus of George Mason. Finishing up the show tonight, last 5 minutes. Thanks for sticking around. Heard from Daniel Frank to talk about GW. He contributes to A10 Talk. And, keep those nuggets in the back of your head because we got GW again on Wednesday. Turning right around. Going to play the Colonials at 7 p.m. Eastern in UD Arena coming up on Wednesday night. So some fun facts for you to end the show tonight. This is going to be the 38th meeting between the Flyers and GW. They first met in 1996 when Dayton joined the A10 conference, and they have never played a game against each other outside of their A10 conference affiliation. Flyers just got the edge in the series last year, 1918. You might remember that game. It was the last game of the season, and Obi Toppin dunked a lot of dunks on their heads, and I believe he ended up with 28 points that night in the final game of the 2020 season. Please hold back your tears. I will move on to my next point. So Flyers lead the series 19-18. They have not played twice in a season since 2012, and that season they actually played once in the regular season and then again in the A10 tournament. GW actually started the series on fire. They won the first 5 meetings between the two schools and 9 of the first 11. So if you're doing quick math out there, the Flyers have won 17 of 24 since that time. So GW, won a lot of games in the 90s and early 2000s, and then Dayton has clawed back in the series. They've won 4 of the last 5 and their last 3 meetings over the last 3 years. I mentioned that GW has not been to the tournament since 2014, and they haven't really been particularly close. I guess maybe in 2016 they were kind of knocking on the door, and they won the NIT that year. But since then, like we mentioned, they are in a giant rebuilding project, and the rebuilding will continue today. Again, anything less than a comfortable win by UD today will definitely be a disappointment. And we talked about the formula for the Flyers. It's got to be Jalen Crutcher and it's got to be Ibby Watson. I wrote a column on Blackburn Review this past week that highlighted that the Flyers' 5 worst offensive performances of the year were their 3 losses, obviously, and then the first game of the year and Ole Miss. In those games, Jalen Crutcher and Ibby Watson combined for less than 25 points and less than 20 shots. In the other 5 games, they obviously have more than 25 points and more than 25 shots, and the Flyers have won all of those games. So I say to you, fair listener, that the formula for the Flyers is quite simple. Jalen Crutcher and Ibby Watson have to lead the scoring effort. They have to be aggressive, and they have to take a lot of shots so that the defense is respecting them early on in the game. And you saw it last week. When Jalen Crutcher is taking shots and being aggressive, the defense has to respect him in such a way that passing lanes are going to open up, and there's going to be more space on the floor for the rest of the contributors. Mainly, we're talking about Moose Amsel, we're talking about Elijah Weaver, and even Jordy. Jordy should have an advantage down low tonight against the bigs of George Washington, but we've kind of seen that go the other direction on the Flyers. We have talked about over the last couple of weeks that on top of Crutcher and Watson being the formula, analytically speaking, the numbers suggest that Dayton is at their best in a 5-guard lineup, playing small ball, playing quickly, and playing up tempo. The Flyers are still turning the ball over at an alarming rate. There's only 4 teams in the entire country that actually turn the ball over more than the Dayton Flyers, and I shudder to think about what the Flyers season would be like if they cut those turnover numbers in half over the last 10 games. I'd be remiss. I have to close the show with a memory of mine against GW. Every year when we play George Washington, I think back to 2005 when I was a freshman in high school, a fresh-faced 14-year-old. I made the trip to UD Arena. I usually made it about twice a year to see Dayton play George Washington. And this would have been towards the end of the season in February of 2005. A pretty good George Washington team came in to UD Arena. They had been ranked that season. They finished the year 22-8, but I brought it up because GW team came in 17-6 to UD Arena. UD had them on the ropes, 59-59, with the ball late, 10 seconds to go. Dayton turned the ball over, and a man by the name of Carl Elliott ran down the court and threw up one of the most ridiculous buzzer beaters I've ever seen. I was in the 200 level of the student section of UD Arena. The ball went through the hoop at the buzzer. Flyers lose 62-59, and Carl Everett famously kept running right into the tunnel and into the locker room. Flyers were losers that night, 62-59. That was again in February 2005. We're going to hope for a better outcome today. Flyers 7.5-point favorites against GW. Tip-off coming up and in a couple of minutes from Eagle Bank Arena. I'm going to say Flyers cover, and we're going to go over. If GW is going to win this game, it's got to be ugly. So if you like GW, the point total is going to be under 140. But I think the safe play today is that the Flyers cover the spread, and I did say 73.5. Flyers are going to get over that plateau too. Tip-offs on the other side. Tune on in today. I believe they're on NBC Sports. That's it for us here at Talking Out Loud Live pregame show. For my friends at ESPN Radio and Timothy's Bar and Grill and Lee's Chicken, I'm your host, Sully. Thanks for sticking around to Talking Out Loud pregame show, brought to you by all those friends I just mentioned. You can only find it right here on ESPN Radio in Dayton.